Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of ANCAP Radio with me, your host Chase Rachels. And now today we're going to be giving you a proof of property rights. So let's begin. Now here's an overview of what we'll be discussing today. Okay, now first I think it would behoove us to talk about what I mean when I say things like legitimate or just. And when I use these terms, what I'm really referring to is what is ethical. Now for an action to have an ethical value attributed to it, it has to fall within the three criteria listed on the screen. The first criterion is that its execution has to be something chosen or something that is optional. Or in other words, if there is no capacity to avoid a certain action, then it cannot have an ethical value attached to it, as ethics imply choice. Secondly, it has to be universally applicable to all people at all times. For instance, I cannot say with any logical validity that theft is unethical, if theft today is okay, but theft tomorrow is not. And likewise, I also may not with any logical consistency say that theft is wrong, but it's okay for some people to steal, but not others. Finally, ethics may only be applied to behavior as their fundamental purpose is to regulate and denote the, quote, rightness or, quote, wrongness of particular forms of human interaction. For example, thinking something in and of itself necessarily does in no way interfere with anyone else. Okay, now let us, before we advance our discussion regarding property rights, first define exactly what property is. Now property is simply that which is rivalrous, material, and owned. And by rivalrous, I mean that it can't be employed the same way by someone else simultaneously. So take for example a ball. If I'm bouncing a ball, then you cannot bounce the same ball at the same time. Or in other words, my bouncing this ball precludes you from bouncing the ball simultaneously. And by material, I simply mean the item or space in question must be tangible. And lastly, to own something simply means to have the exclusive right to control or employ a given good or space. Okay, now that we've established the definitions for our terms, let's explore the principle of self-ownership. Now before we can claim to own external material, we must first affirm that we own ourselves. So how do we prove this? Well, first we must put it through our validity test. Now for something to be valid, it must be both universally applicable and able to exist within objective reality. So let's see if the claim that every individual owns him or herself can pass this test. Now, can this be consistently and universally applied? Well, yes. For one person to own him or herself does not preclude a second person from owning him or herself. Now, can it exist within objective reality? Well, of course, everyone has the capacity to physically exercise the ownership of their own bodies simultaneously. Great! Now let's apply the same test to the only two alternative claims of bodily ownership. Now the first alternative is that a second person or set of people have a higher claim on your body than you do. So is this logically consistent to say that some humans can own others and others cannot? No, absolutely not. The fact that some can own others cannot be universally applied and therefore fails our test of validity. The second alternative is that everyone owns an equal share of everyone else. Now can this be universally applied to all people? Well, yes, it can, so it passes the first test of universal applicability. Now, can this setup exist within objective reality? Well, no. If everyone owned everyone else, it would be impossible for any person to justly act. For prior to executing any action, one would have to get prior approval from all of his or her co-owners, i.e. the 7 billion other people on Earth, which is clearly impossible. But let's assume that the act of being able to interact with all 7 billion people on Earth were possible, and furthermore, that unanimous consent was given to take the act in question. Could one justly execute an action then? Well, no, because all 7 billion people would have unjustly given you approval for this action, for giving approval is an action itself, and would have required everyone's approval to give approval, and etc., etc. Now this is what is known as infinite regression. Thus, we can see that the second alternative is unable to exist within objective reality and is thereby invalid. If this doesn't convince you though, we can even prove the validity of self-ownership argumentatively. meaning for someone to assert that the concept of self-ownership to be invalid would be what is known as a performative contradiction, and that the implications of their action of arguing, that is, that they own the words of their argument and therefore themselves, contradict the content of their speech, i.e., that self-ownership is invalid. In other words, it would be a self-refuting claim. Well, now that we have proven the validity of self-ownership, let's move on. Okay, next we have the non-aggression principle. Now the non-aggression principle is actually a derivative of the principle of self-ownership, as it asserts that everyone has the right to live free of coercive interference from other human beings. Now coercion here is defined as the threat or application of unwanted physical interference to a person's body or property. Now the reason I say it is a derivative of the self-ownership principle is that for someone to violate the non-aggression principle would be for them to limit how said person can exercise control over his or her own property. Now some claim that property is merely a convention. Well, this is true, but conventions have a purpose, and that purpose is to be applied in such a way to avoid otherwise unavoidable conflict. So, with this in mind, allow me to advance the theory of justice and property I see to be the most suitable to achieving these ends, and likewise to show how the alternatives to this theory are necessarily counterproductive to these ends. Now there are three and only three legitimate or just means to acquire property, the first of which is by original appropriation. What this means is that the first user of a good or space in nature is the proper owner of said good or space if he or she so chooses. Now this theory was originated by John Locke and is also more commonly known as homesteading. Now this clearly achieves the end of conflict avoidance, as no conflict, by virtue of the fact of being first, can possibly exist, as there necessarily cannot be any competing claims. But why not the second or third comer? Well, this would not serve to avoid conflict, as is the purpose of a convention, but rather it would only serve to generate it between the first and second comers, or the second and third comers, or the first and third comers, etc., etc. Well, why cannot everyone own this good or land? Well, because in this case the human race would perish, since it would be impossible to gain everyone's prior approval to exercise said ownership. It would land us in the infinite regression dilemma described earlier. Now, the second means is a consequence of the first, as it states that anything you produce with your justly acquired property is also yours, so long as in the process of this production you do not damage the physical integrity of someone else's justly acquired property. And the third and final means one may acquire property is through a voluntary exchange of justly acquired property from one person to another. Now, if one has acquired property by any means other than the three just listed, then he or she has acquired it unjustly. Okay, now what are the takeaways from this proof of property? Well, the first one I find is pretty compelling, which is that no rights exist independently of property rights. For if they did, then they would be able to come into conflict. And as stated earlier, for something to be ethical, it must be universally applicable to all people at all times. Now, for example, let's pretend that the right of free speech existed independently of the right to property. Now, given this, we'll set up a hypothetical situation where Joe invites Bob to a party at his house on the condition that Bob does not use profane language in his household. Well, later that night, Bob is at Joe's house and starts cursing. Now, from the situation, only one of two things can logically follow. Either Joe violates Bob's right of speech by kicking him out of his house, or Bob violates Joe's property rights by continuing to use profane language on Joe's property against Joe's consent. Now, because the potential of a situation like this to arise, we can confidently say that both rights, so-called rights that is, cannot be valid simultaneously and independent of each other, since for something to be a right it has to have at least the capacity to always be exercised, and whose exercising cannot conflict with someone else's exercising of their rights. And since we've already definitively proven property rights, we can confidently say that it is property rights that exist and not the so-called right of free speech. Now, to clarify, encompassed within property rights are the right to speak, dance, or do whatever else it is you want to do on your own property. Thus, the other rights many tend to claim fall under the umbrella of property rights. Now, the second takeaway we have is that the state must be an unethical entity in practice, as it is always and perpetually existing and operating in violation of the property rights of others, in that it lays taxes, which amount to theft, and implements mandatory edicts, which in effect tell a person he or she has to behave or dispose of his or her own property in a particular way despite his or her consent, or face violent retribution. And this is clearly would be constituting a violation of the NAP. Now, some may try to get around this by saying that the state gains its legitimacy through a social contract in which everyone gives their tacit consent through either the choice to stay under its alleged jurisdiction and or to benefit from the public goods that it offers. However, the state never had the authority to make such an arrangement in the first place, because the so-called public goods that it offers were not acquired justly, as elaborated upon earlier. Now take the roads, for example. The state acquired the resources to build the roads through means of expropriation, and not of original appropriation, of voluntary exchange, excuse me. Thus, the state has no just authority by which to create such a social contract with others in the first place. Again, you can't make a valid contract with someone which involves the conditional usage of resources that a member of said contract does not legitimately own. Furthermore, the state is a fiction, meaning it does not exist in objective reality, and thus cannot make any contracts on that token alone. What do exist are individuals who claim to be agents of the state that offer the exchange of stolen goods in exchange for its prospective beneficiaries' submission. Now, these aforementioned points are more than sufficient to render any such social contract invalid. Okay, now some people I like to credit for this presentation are Hans Hermann Hoppe and Rothbard. Their works greatly inspired the formulation of this presentation. And furthermore, I also want to thank Neil Tokar and Blake Williams for helping me to develop some of the ways I wanted to go about this video. Thank you guys, thank you Hoppe, thank you Rothbard, and thank you audience for listening. Okay, now if you enjoy this presentation, you can subscribe to my channel, my YouTube channel that is, at youtube.com/ANCAPChase. Or you could join my Facebook page at facebook.com/ANCAPradio. And if you really like this presentation and you would see more like it in the future with perhaps a higher production quality, please donate to me at tinyurl.com/donateANCAPChase. Thanks guys.